and self-possession, self-containment, self-actualization, and in doing that, they get a small grant of normative worth in the eyes of others. Not moral worth, but normative worth. You know, and you're all achieving that. You all look pretty together to me. You know, you look pretty self-possessed, self-contained, and self-reliant. Okay, and some of you may secretly know that you're not quite as together as you appear to others. Okay, but you discipline your expressions of life to reproduce this, and you get a small grant of normative worth. People who are referred to me, when they're struggling with auditory hallucinations, they're out of the running. Is that clear? There's just no way that they're in the running. This is an anathema to what it means to be a real person in our culture. You know, self-possession is not an option. And this leads to powerful conclusions about failure, about the futility of living. Self-reliance is not that option either. And so this has powerful consequences in terms of, people's lives, and, that these people feel dispirited, they have a sense that their life is hopeless, they don't have a sense of having a valued future. This has powerful consequences for them. It's not mutual in its effects. So, but we can do this about every understanding, and it's part of my narrative endeavour is to deconstruct these taken for granted ideas, so we're not tied to them. And I think it's a useful thing for us to be doing. And how many of you have relationship dynamics? Some of you have relationship dynamics. Is it a good idea to have them? Is it a good idea to have relationship dynamics? There's no choice. There is a choice, because you see that dynamics are now being displaced by issues. More and more couples that I see no longer talk about coming along about the dynamics, they talk about issues. So I think that dynamics are getting displaced by issues. What did you have before 1966? When you were feeling miserable in your relationships, what did you have before the rise of dynamics? Do you remember what you had back then?
Problems.
You might have had problems, yeah. You had communication problems. You had a communication disorder or communication breakdown. You had masked and indirect communication, or open and indirect communication, or there are all these. So from the end of World War II until the mid-60s, people had communication problems. Since the mid-60s until recently, they had relationship dynamics. Now they're having issues. These are constructions, and they do have consequences in terms of how people act. And so it's interesting to think about how all of these taken for granted understandings have a cultural and relational history. Now, why is this so important in narrative practice?
Well, no, I guess I'll wait. But I wanted to bring up an ethical issue of these labels and these constructs. For example, I'm actually very grateful that a term such as child abuse exists.
Yeah.
Because that's a new term.
Yeah.
And without its existence, there wasn't laws to protect children from being, because they were property, to be treated without any kind of rights.
Yeah.
So civil rights, for example, when they have these terms, can be used hopefully for some kind of benefit.
Yeah.
So what about the abolition of these terms when they're
I'm not talking about abolishing anything.
right, or when they don't exist in a culture? Is it wrong to impose it, or are there terms that you try and find within the culture that have some kind of similar meaning, or is there? I mean, because we work within a construct ourselves, and it's really hard to take ourselves out of it.
Yeah.
We've been trained that way.
Yeah. Yes, I'm not talking about eradicating anything. I'm just talking about deconstruction. I'm not talking about events that are named like child abuse or sexual harassment. I'm talking about identity inclusions, which is a very different matter. Someone would say to me, well, wait a minute, you're saying that everything is constructed. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not a sort of radical constructivist. I'm not saying that's not a chair you're sitting on. I'm talking about identity conclusions, identity categories, and I'm talking about the importance of actually deconstructing these. And so I'm not suggesting there's not a hard world out there, you know, a material world out there. So I'm just talking about these conclusions that we have about life and identity, how we give the way, I guess the ways that we go about representing experience as reflections on life or identity or relationship. So that's all. Now, why am I? Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. It's just really helpful to me to hear you say that, because a lot of the work that I do is like with newly immigrated young people.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a lot of what they're struggling with, is kind of like the two worlds that they're straddling.
Yeah.
And so I feel like being able to like hear you like deconstruct it, I feel it's helps to like navigate in those conversations and navigate kind of what they're going through in terms of being able to like understand their experience and reflect on it.
Yeah, it can be hugely important in that work, can't it? To be more aware of the things in our own culture that we take for granted. And so Bourdieu was a philosopher or sociologist whose work I got very interested in, and Bourdieu talked about how historically anthropologists would go into so-called traditional cultures or exotic cultures, and they'd understand what was happening in those cultures in terms of their own domestic culture. And he called this domesticating the exotic, you know, and that's been powerfully challenged. You know, there was, for example, British anthropology was functionalist anthropology, and we saw the demise of functionalist anthropology in the late 1960s, and it had to do with the challenging of this. This was like domesticating the exotic. You know, it was actually putting a systems analysis on other cultures, and people brought along informers from those cultures who challenged the anthropologists who were presenting their fieldwork, saying, it's interesting that you think that this event serves a function for maintaining the homeostasis of our community, but why don't you ask us what it means? And this brought about the interpretive turn in the social sciences. And in the social sciences, it became impossible for social scientists to put those systems analysis on other cultures. Unfortunately, that held on, you know, in the psychological sciences, and we still see people coming up with those interpretations of life. But it is very, very important. And, now, why is it important to narrative practice? Well, you know, it means that we can actually wind up in conversations with people that we would not otherwise be in, and it just opens the way. And, for example, if I was to see Deanne's expression of distinguishing what's unfair as to do with human nature, that here we see a representation of her true experience. You know, that this is her speaking with her real voice about, you know, and it's as part of, it's only part of human nature for people to actually, I guess, discern injustice or whatever. Then we won't be asking questions about the social and relational and cultural history of the value that she gives to fairness. If I'm working with Frederick, who's been through a lot of abuse and trauma right through his life, and escaped this to live on the streets as an adolescent as a sex worker, and he's now in his 20s and been referred to be my accommodation service on account of his suicidal actions and his depression. And when I'm talking with Frederick, he talks openly about how despairing he is. And he tells me that despair is increasing, you know, and he predicts he's not going to be on this earth for much longer. You know, he's actually made several attempts on his life, and his future's futile. And I get really interested in this. Like, he is discerning despair or distinguishing despair. How is that possible? So I say to Frederick, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand why you're despairing. He said, well, surely you'd know. You're a counsellor. as I said, I was removed from my own family when I was 7 after 7 years of abuse and neglect, and I was put into a foster home. I got abused there, and I was then in a state institution, which was just a terrible place, and I escaped onto the streets, etc., etc. My life has been like an emotional, psychological wilderness. So sure, you'd understand why I'm despairing. I said, no, I don't get it. I don't understand why you would not be simply resigned to your circumstances of life. I don't understand this. And I don't understand why your despair is getting worse either. I don't get that. And so, why are you not simply resigned to what life has served up to you? And why is your despair getting worse? What are you getting separated from that might have actually sustained you, at least to a minimal degree, up to this point in time? What is it that you're getting separated from? We talk about that for a while, and he says, well, I did have this ridiculous hope, futile hope, that my life might be different, but that hope's betrayed me and I've abandoned it. Okay. Well, isn't that interesting? So I get to hear more about the despair, but I also ask Frederick if I can actually ask him some questions about this hope, and I make it clear that I'm not going to try and convince him that there's any hope for his life. I make it clear I'm not the holder of hope, but I'm curious about this. He gives me permission to explore this with him, on the understanding that I'm not going to try and talk him into the idea that there was any substance to this hope. I'm just curious about this phenomenon. So I say to him, what's that hope all about, And Frederick goes naturalistic on me. Human nature is such a broad phenomenon these days that people go naturalistic all the time. And so he says that, sure, you'd understand that, this has to do with human nature. It's only part of being human. We have a lot of ideas about like that, what it means to be human. That's all based on these naturalistic understandings. It's only human to actually have some hope through life's traumas. And I said, okay, so and I honour that understanding. That's a beautiful sentiment. Is that clear? But it's a cultural sentiment, okay? And so I say, I understand that, but Frederick, I know that for some of your peers, this hope was extinguished. You told me about 2 of your friends committing suicide. So I guess it's something that can be extinguished. And he argued that it can be extinguished. And I said, well, I'm just wondering how you've maintained a relationship with it through this time. I'm just wondering whether there's any experiences that you could share with me that would give me an understanding of what reinforced this hope to the point that you could at least hold on to it until recently. Like, we wouldn't be talking now if you hadn't maintained a relationship with this hope. So what stories about your life could you tell me that would give me a sense of how this hope was validated, or experiences that might have verified that it was valid for you to have hope? I don't understand this. I don't get this. I'll come back to the story about Frederick later, because he's suddenly telling me a story that he shared with nobody in his entire life. It was a story about being abducted or kidnapped at a certain point in his life, and it was this abduction that actually brought hope to his life, and I'll share that story with you later. But you see, if I understand that hope is part of human nature, if I understand that when people go naturalistic, they're expressing contemporary culture, that in ways that are likely to dead end conversations, I can go beyond that. I can explore the social and relational history of what people give value to. With Deanne, for example, when she talks about this being unfair, she's giving value to fairness. What's the social and relational history to that? Okay, so I begin to ask her questions. How is it that she's able to reach this conclusion about it being unfair to be doing this? I don't get this. And so I ask Deanne some questions, and with the support, and she responds with the support of her foster parents, and she tells me about Pippi Longstocking. She's not even told her foster parents this, that when she was younger, she actually escaped into Pippi Longstocking. Who knows Pippi Longstocking? Okay, most of you know Pippi Longstocking. Pippi Longstocking is one of Astrid Lindgren's characters, and Astrid Lindgren was a Swedish author who actually smuggled feminism into children's literature in the 1940s. And Pippi Longstocking is is a girl, very strong. What do you know about Pippi Longstocking? Very independent. She lives in a house by herself with a horse on the veranda. What else do you know about Pippi Longstocking?
Is she an orphan?
Well, she wouldn't say so, but her father is a sea captain that was away, but she wouldn't categorise herself as an orphan. What do you know about her? Yeah?
I thought she had a loving relationship with her dad. Like
Yes.
it was positive, although he wasn't always there.
That's right, he wasn't there, yeah. And she challenged every power relation of local culture. You know, she challenged power relations in the schoolroom and she gets thrown out of school. She challenged the power relations of class. She challenged the power relations of adultism. And she has a strong voice on what's not fair. And so I then organised to meet with Deanne and her parents, foster parents, for the next meeting, and I brought in my copy of Pippi Longstocking, and together we read her favourite passages. Took turns in reading her favourite passage, which was that about the Tea Party incident, where she challenges power relations of class in the most extraordinary way, and we're virtually rolling around the floor in hysterics over this. And so Pippi Longstocking is so outrageous and so funny in the way that she challenges these power relations of class, and so we're getting onto the social and relational history to what Deanne gives value to. So I'm not seeing this expression of what's fair and not fair as part to do with a strength or a resource. Is that clear? It's to do with something that's social and relational. And so we together write a letter to Astrid Lindgren, who's deceased. So we don't post it, but Deanne has 10 copies of this, and she goes to school with one copy in her shoe and one copy in her lunchbox. And when she's feeling really a bit overwhelmed in these peer relational situations, she finds a private space and she gets out this letter and she reads it, and the letter is actually from Astrid Lindgren to Deanne. Okay, it's quite a beautiful letter. And so at my next meeting, the third meeting, there are 3 other children present. I refer to these children as the outsider witnesses. They're drawn from my registers. You know, nearly everybody who consults me, at the end of my work with them, they volunteer for their name to be entered into one of my registers, to join me in my work with people who follow in their footsteps. So these other 3 children had been referred to me under similar circumstances that addressed their trauma in the work that we did together, and they volunteered to join me in my work with others who follow in their stories. Not to take responsibility, but to be available to come along and to be an audience to a conversation. So these 3 other children are present. You know, they get to have a bit of a chat to Deanne and her foster parents, and then I asked the 3 children to sit back and I interviewed Deanne about the story. You know, that's about her connection to Pippi Longstocking and Astrid Lindgren and what that made possible for her, and you know, how that's made it possible for her to respond to the trauma that she's been through. And so now these halfway through the interview, I asked Deanne and her foster parents to sit back, and I interviewed the 3 children about what they've heard in Deanne's story. So this is not about dialogue. Okay, there's like structured levels of telling and retelling. At the beginning, these 3 children were strictly in the audience position. Now Deanne and her foster parents are strictly in the audience position. It's not about dialogue. And the 3 children are talking to me about what they heard from Deanne. They're not talking to Deanne about that. They're gossiping about her in her presence. Okay, so and this is very important. If they were to directly engage Deanne, in their responses, it's very unlikely Deanne would hear what she would otherwise hear. So that would actually dispossess her of that audience position, and she would not hear what she would otherwise hear. So I interview these 3 children. I don't say, what did you think of that? I say, no, what did you hear that caught your attention? And one of these kids said, oh, Deanne's fantastic. She went superlative. Okay, people go superlative very often. It's a very common cultural phenomenon to go superlative these days. And, why is it that people say wonderful so much in contemporary Western culture? You hear this all the time. Do you know why that is, the history of that? Okay. It has to do with a transition that took place in the history of Christianity. At a certain point in the history of Christianity, curiosity became a vice. And people were incited to wonder at the deities instead. It became curiosity particularly became a vice for women, you know. And so we see the rise of wonder as a cultural phenomenon. And so these days, when someone has done something that you're drawn to, you say that's wonderful. You don't actually ask them about how they took that step or how they got ready for it, or, you know, we say it's wonderful. So we see the rise of wonder. You know, it's such a broad phenomenon in contemporary Western culture.
Or it's awesome.
Awesome is the new one. Awesome.
Same
Awesome.
thing.
It's the same thing. Awesome. That's a distinctly North American. You know, I don't hear that in Australia. Things, the Australian culture is not awesome. You know, it's not an awesome culture. Whereas American culture is awesome. You have awesomeness here, lots of awesomeness, and a lot of needists, and so on. And so. So I say to that young girl, look, I understand that you think that Deanne is fantastic, but what were you drawn to? What was it? What were the words? What did you actually hear from Deanne? What were the feelings? What was it that struck a chord for you? Could you describe what it was that you experienced from Deanne? Okay? So that these children render their interest as particular interest, not universal human interest, highly particular interest. And then I say to them, okay, so I now understand what you were all drawn to, and they're all drawn to different expressions of the story. And I got them, one of the other kids said, well, I was drawn to what Julie was drawn to. And I say, yes, but give me your words for it. Okay? So that Deanne's expressions get more richly described through the retelling, and it's about particularities. And I then say, well, what did that trigger in your mind? You know, what came to you in terms of pictures of Deanne's life, or you know, were there certain metaphors or images, or what sense did you have of Deanne from this? What was that? So I encourage these children to draw out the image, and I help them render that symbolic in form. Okay? So one of these kids was actually been introduced to rock climbing, and they came up with this lovely metaphor. That was a rock climbing metaphor. We get to a certain point in rock climbing, you know, you have this experience, and had this image of Deanne's rock climbing in the place that she'd got to. You know, so it's very important these images are drawn out in a symbolic form. And so I then said to these 3 children, why were you drawn to what you were drawn to? You know, what was it? You know, what did it touch for you? What lit up for you? So that they indicate their interest is personal, not academic. It's engaged interest, not armchair interest. It's active interest, not passive interest. And so they all talked about what the story touched on in their own histories. Okay? They began to speak about how they'd responded to trauma they went through. Okay? They began to speak about their responses, and I interviewed them a little bit about what lit up for them. It's not possible for us to sit down and be an audience to these powerful dramas of life unfolding without reverberations coming into the history of our own experience, and without experiences resonating, lighting up, you know, coming into conscious awareness. And fourthly, I asked these children what it was like to be present. for this conversation. Where were they at the end of this that they wouldn't have been if they'd been at school, or if they'd been out playing netball or whatever it is that they do? Where is this taking them to? You know, what's it been like to be present? Now, one of these kids talked about how they felt even more respect for how they'd responded to what they'd been through. That was more visible to them. They were feeling more respect for themselves, or more pride. Okay? So that's like being transported or being moved on account of being present. And another one of these kids had this idea about something that they wanted to follow up in their own life, and that somehow this had clarified the importance of that. You know, it had to do with a conversation they planned to have with one of their siblings that they'd been a bit estranged from, and so all of these three children are doing what I call acknowledging transport, or acknowledging catharsis. You know, and I'm thinking about catharsis with a K. You know, not the modern version of catharsis, but the Greek, more classical understanding of catharsis. You know, in ancient Greece, the predominant version of catharsis went like this. If you went along to witness the performance of Greek tragedy, and this moved you to another place in your mind, in your perceptions, in your understandings of your own life, or to another place in terms of possibilities in your own life, that was cathartic. Okay? So if it moved you, it was cathartic, but it wasn't being moved in the narrow contemporary sense of being moved, like to have an emotion. It was a much broader sense. So if on account of witnessing this performance you had a new perspective on your own history, or if you were re-engaging with values that were precious to you that you'd forsaken, or if you had new ideas about how you might proceed in life, or you had suddenly a strong desire to have a particular conversation with a family member, then it was cathartic. Okay? So this is the more classical understanding of catharsis. So these three children acknowledge catharsis. I want you to imagine what that is like for Deanne, who had little sense of personal agency, felt very vulnerable. Here she is in a situation experiencing ripples coming out of her expressions of life, touching the lives of these other three children in ways that made a difference to them, that was important to them. Okay? What does that do in terms of restoring a sense of personal agency and a sense of worth? I mean, you could tell Deanne every day of her life that she's really worthwhile. Okay, this would not be as powerful as one outsider witness response in which catharsis is acknowledged. Now, later we'll come back to working with trauma. I would say that in all of my work with trauma, I take care to arrange a context in which outsider witness responses can be given, because these are incredibly healing of trauma. I don't know of a more powerful therapeutic practice in response to healing from trauma. And so I then asked Deanne the same, I then interviewed Deanne around the same categories of inquiry. What had she heard from these three other children? What had she heard from these three other young people that had caught her attention? What were the words? What was the... if Deanne didn't say it's awesome, because that's not an Australian thing to say, but if she had said this is awesome, I'd said, I don't know what we're talking about. What were the words? What was it that you heard or sensed or experienced? It's like asking the person to render that tangible in some way. And so, what did this trigger in your mind? What did it say to you about yourself? How did it affect your picture of who you are? And then I invited her to render that into symbolic form. The rendering of this symbolic is very, very important, and we'll talk about why that is a bit later. We'll talk about how that plays a role in reinvigorating this language of inner life. I then wanted to know why Deanne was so drawn to what she heard, what did it touch on for her, and in response to that she began to describe some of her other responses to trauma that had been not visible to her before. Okay? She became aware that she became even more clear that she had not been a passive recipient of the trauma she'd been subject to. And then I wanted to know where that took her to, in terms of transport or catharsis. So the same questions. Now, we're going to take a break soon, but I just wanted to say that we went beyond this. At follow-up, I'd found a woman author to represent Astrid Lindgren. This was a woman author of children's stories who lived locally, and she represented Astrid Lindgren. So I interviewed Deanne about the story, which by this time has become much richer. It's been embroidered upon. And Deanne is so much more aware of her response to the trauma she's been through and the foundations of that in terms of what she gives value to. That's so more richly described, isn't it? You know, the value that she gives to fairness and what that makes it possible for her to distinguish, etc., etc. Now, in this interview, I then asked Deanne to sit back, and I interviewed the woman author about what she'd heard. I said, if Astrid Lindgren was here, what's your guess about what you'd be drawn to in Deanne's story? I'm getting the woman author to speak to me so that Deanne can be an audience. And so the woman author speaks about her guess about what Astrid Lindgren would be drawn to. Well, what would this tell Astrid Lindgren about Deanne? And what's your guess about how she'd paint that out in words or pictures? Once again, rendering this symbolic. This image of Deanne becomes symbolic. Why do you think Astrid Lindgren would be so drawn to this? You know? And what's your guess about where it would take Astrid Lindgren to? And this woman author gave a beautiful account of catharsis. And she talked about how, this would make everything that Astrid Lindgren ever did worthwhile. And it would actually reinforce for her purposes. It would touch on what her existence was all about for her in ways that were very confirming. It would be very warming of Astrid Lindgren. And then I asked this woman author, where did it take you to? So we had this double acknowledgement of transport. And this woman author said some very beautiful things and then followed this up in a couple of letters to Deanne. That opened up some new ideas for her about a book that she'd been struggling to write. And this book was actually for children who had been subject to trauma. And so Deanne experienced her contribution to that project. Isn't that extraordinary? And now, I just want to say a couple of things about this, and that is that as this, what it is that Deanne gives value to is more richly described, this dissolves shame. Is that clear? Totally dissolves the shame, because as this becomes more richly described, she's far more able to draw this distinction around what's just and what's unjust in her history. This is dissolving of the shame. I think the repeopling of her identity, had a powerful effect of actually dealing with the insomnia and dismissing these nightmares from her life. She experienced Pippi Longstocking's voice more present. Astrid Lindgren's voice was present. It was even there materially in the letter form. The voice of these other three children, the voice of this woman author. So there's a repeopling of Deanne's identity, and that's a huge piece, I think, of the outcome of these narrative conversations, that it really is an antidote to the whole idea of self as hero. It's a very isolating idea, and the idea that it was Deanne's courage, that she, independently dealt with these forces of tyranny, and this is a reflection on her courage and this heroic status that gets built up. These ideas that elevate people above others in ways, these are very isolating, they're very problematic. There's so much potential for things to come undone for that person when they feel their next action wasn't up to scratch, but it's very isolating. So this is an antidote to the whole idea of self as hero. Deanne is no longer she's not seeing her actions as an expression of a strength or a resource, she's seeing her actions as an expression of a legacy. That's a very rich legacy. The story of her life is joined with the story of Pippi Longstocking's life, with the story of Astrid Lindgren's life, with the story of the lives of these three children, with the story of this woman author representing Astrid Lindgren. around shared and precious themes. Okay, and so this makes the world of difference. The other thing I want to say about this that really made such a difference for Deanne, in my view, is that traumatic memory was restored to its fullness. As you know, most traumatic memory is half memory. And so most people who consult us about trauma, well, not most people, because some people are starting with dissociated memory, but even that's half memory. Okay, it's not conscious, but it's half memory. So most traumatic memory is half memory, because what's excluded from traumatic memory is an account of the person's response to trauma and the foundation of that response. That response is founded upon what people give value to, and it's founded upon some of the knowledges of life and the skills of living. No one is a passive recipient of trauma, no one. But most accounts of trauma are half memories. And now it's not by chance. You know, I could share many stories with you that give an account of the circumstances favourable to the development of half memory. And now traumatic memory is always going to be distressing if it's half memory, because there's no way that this can be taken into that system of memories that might make up the preferred storyline of the person's life, because that system of memories has an account of people responding to experiences of life in ways that are consistent with what they give value to. And if traumatic memory is a half memory, it cannot be taken into history. Is that clear? It's not going to have a beginning and an ending, because it's not associated with that system of memories that make up a preferred account of a person's life. That preferred account is an account of responses to a range of experiences and predicaments that are consistent with what they give value to across time. So it's very important that we render these traumatic memories full memories, not half memories, so that they can be taken into history, so that they have a beginning and an ending. You know, that's so important. We'll come back to that idea, because it's such an important idea, a bit later in the workshop. Now, I think that you're probably all aware of the sorts of circumstances that contribute to traumatic memory being half memory. And some people say, well, why do some people do better with trauma and not others? Well, I think for some, traumatic memory has remained more full. And I was working with a young man who was very suicidal. He's 15 years of age, and he's morose. He believes that his life is over. He has this idea that he's damaged and messed up. The history is that he and his mother escaped the violence of the father 2 years earlier, when he was 13, after repeated attempts to get away. And this mother is desperate about her son, preoccupied about him. She's the sole income earner, but she can't concentrate on her work, and then her job's at risk. Because of her preoccupation, she recently took a look when he wasn't around at his diary and confirmed her concerns about suicide. And he agrees to come in to see me, but only for his mother's sake, not for his. And he says to me very clearly that this is for my mother, and you couldn't say that he was overly enthusiastic about this therapeutic consultation. And so he says he says besides that it was worse for my mother. He witnessed his mother being assaulted on many occasions. And so I said to he only has memories of the trauma. He doesn't have a memory of his response. This is contributing to almost the erasure of a sense of personal agency and acute vulnerability. I asked some questions, and his mother said this is an expression of him giving value to her life. She says, I know that he treasures me, I know that. And I say, well, how do you know that? And she says, it's just what a mother knows. Okay? So I say, well, that's very beautiful. And but my guess is you've actually witnessed actions on your son's behalf that confirm that knowledge. Can you tell me stories about your son's actions in life that would confirm this. Suddenly Mary is telling me a story about how when, she recalls a story about how when Jason was 8 years of age, she was being assaulted by this man. In the midst of this, there's this sound of smashing glass. And this man stops hitting her and goes into the front room, and there's shards of glass all over the front room. Someone pitched a rock through the window. And Mary looks out the window, and guess who she sees running off down the street? Jason. Okay. And guess what his father does? He pursues him, gives him a good thrashing, and then ridicules him constantly at every opportunity over the next 6 months over the value that he gives to his mother's life. Now, now it's interesting that Jason can remember this assault, but he cannot remember his action. That's been erased. Now, why has it been erased? Well, it's been punished, it's been ridiculed, it's been diminished, it's been demeaned. You know, it's been dishonoured. It's not part of the historical record. And so, you know, this is not me. You know, it's such a extraordinary thing, isn't it? So, I'll share more of that story with you later. I've got a DVD or a videotape of part of that session we can look at if you're interested. But it was the beginnings of the development of the subordinate storyline, which was about his response to a whole range of experiences and what that was founded upon. And so, so with Deanne, I think we're playing a part in restoring traumatic memory to its fullness. I think this is critical. If it's not restored to its fullness, it's going to be traumatizing, isn't it? Because if it cannot be associated with that system of memories that make up a preferred sense of who one might be, that features an account of actions across time that are consistent with what one gives value to, then it cannot be taken into history. It has no beginning and no end. So, you know, people are very vulnerable to reliving the trauma of those memories under these circumstances. It's the same with dissociated memory. You know, the task is for us to, you know, these days there are dissociated people, but there didn't used to be. Okay, there were no dissociated people. There was dissociated memory. And this whole idea comes from a French psychologist called Janet. And his idea was that memories are dissociated with because they cannot be dissociated because they cannot be associated with that system of memories that make up the sort of preferred storylines of people's lives. They're therefore disassociated. And they're like satellites out there, and people are vulnerable to reliving these memories, you know, through frightening visual images or heavy negative conclusions that are disabling of them, and they seem to come out of the blue. And so we'll talk a little bit about ideas for addressing dissociated memories based on what I've been sharing with you this morning. We probably need to stop. It's been a pretty long exposition of these ideas. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to come back after we break to show videotapes that are a reflection of these ideas, and I'll invite you in turn to reflect on these, and we'll gradually build up some maps for working with people struggling with trauma. Yeah.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Awesome. At least it wasn't wonderful.
Better
Oh,
say
okay.
it with the mic.
All right, thank you. I guess, I don't know if it's anything very profound, but just for me, I think how you use the idea of witnessing and make it something that is not just something that you do for the client, but that you make other people do for the client, and how healing that can be. I think that to me, I've always felt scared to bring in other people, even though I feel that it's so wonderful when they can have a group experience of witnessing. And in a very, it was interesting, as you said, that you didn't want a dialogue between them, that you just wanted very clearly to delineate, you're going to witness what this person is saying, and how that can be very safe for a person, and yet also very powerful because they don't have the responsibility of engaging, that they can just be, they can receive purely receive, which I think is really a gift to be able to do for someone. And I'm just trying to understand, do your clients know that this is going to be a part of their treatment beforehand? Or is it something that you just tell them? Because I'm wondering if, like here, if I were to try and do that, for example, would there be a liability, for example, oh, I don't want somebody to know what happened to me, I don't want to, of any kind. I was just curious how you do that, how you tell them.
I guess the first thing is that outside of witnesses can achieve something that we can't achieve as counsellors or therapists. They have options that we don't have. Like if we were to actually respond in that way, because of the power relation of therapy, it could be very imposing, and we'd be centering our voices as therapists. But because there's not the same power relation with outside of witnesses, and because we interview people about what struck a chord with them and what didn't, they're able to distinguish and make these distinctions. And when we ask them about the why of these distinctions, it's very clear, not a context in which they will experience imposition. And so I think that it's possible for outsider witnesses to respond even more resonantly than we can respond. And I think that resonance is the key term here, that these outsider witnesses are not, their response is not shaped by traditions of empathy or sympathy or intervention or evaluation. It's really shaped by this whole idea of resonance. And the idea with resonance is that the outsider witnesses actually represent in the external world what it is that the person internally gives value to. It's a representation in the external world of what people give value to. But it's a very rich representation, and it's one that is linked to certain images that appear in symbolic form. And it's also a sort of highly acknowledging representation in which the person experiences some of the important themes of their lives linked to the themes of the lives of others. And the acknowledgement of catharsis also makes it very resonant. And so resonance is the focus. And it's this resonance that I think not only contributes to the rich development of the subordinate storylines we're talking about, but it also reinvigorates and redevelops that language of inner life that we depend upon for a sense of personal warmth and intimacy, and that we depend upon as a foundation to relate to others intimately. So resonance is the key term, key idea. I think that it's important to be concerned about some of the hazards of inviting people in to play this role. And if we are aware of those hazards, then we can establish a context in which it's very unlikely that those hazards will be performed. I actively interview the outsider witnesses around these 4 categories of inquiry, which I'll put up a PowerPoint a bit later with those 4 categories on them. These 4 categories of inquiry are the outcome of my own private research over many years around interviewing people about what was the most powerful aspect of these retellings for them. And I originally had about 8 categories, and they've gradually been distilled down to these 4. These seem to be the 4 most significant categories of response that contribute to rich story development, acknowledgement, that seem to be the most healing in response to trauma. The other reason that I structure this is that if I don't restructure the retelling, what happens is simply a reproduction of the known and the familiar. You see outsider witnesses getting into superlatives that are unhelpful, sometimes they even go one down in that, like you've achieved something that I couldn't have achieved. They elevate other people, and that's very problematic. That elevation is very problematic. Or they get into these practices of giving affirmation, these practices of the applause, and that might be a nice buzz for people, but it's not enduring. It doesn't contribute in any enduring way to story development. It doesn't contribute to that healing in any enduring sense. Or they get into making interpretations, or there are the or making judgments, positive judgments, but it's still judgments. Like Deanne's done very well. Like she gets 11 out of 10. That's still judgment. It's part of it constructs a power relationship. One person is in a position to judge the adequacy of someone else's actions. So there are all these traditions of acknowledgement that are at large, and there's no response to someone's life that isn't shaped by a tradition. These responses are in language, they're in culture, they're part of the tradition, and so we want to see if we can circumvent these sorts of traditions so that people, it's paradoxical, in that structuring the retelling, people wind up speaking about what they would never imagine speaking about in their retelling. In fact, it's very paradoxical because the outsider witnesses break from known and familiar ways of responding, and they, as an outcome of being the outsider witness, they actually move closer to what is possible for them to know and do in their own lives. And they could never have been able to predict this, ahead of the conversation. So I don't want the outsider witnesses to plan what they're going to say. I want them to be available to me to interview them, because then they don't have to, A, they don't have to plan it, B, they don't have to monitor it, because I've got the permission to ask questions, and C, they'll actually be speaking about what they wouldn't have imagined speaking about, and D, it's more likely that their response will be resonant, not, it won't be to do with just giving an affirmation or whatever. The other point is that, no, I don't tell people this is part of the scheme because it's an option. That's all. It's just an option. However, I can count on my one hand the number of times this option has been declined in the last 20 years. And I've seen countless families and people in the last 20 years. Now, some people might, when it's introduced as an option, they might want to understand more about it. They might want to actually speak to someone who's had this experience. I have people who volunteer to be consulted about it, who've been on the inside of these outside witness practices. So, on very rare occasions, have people declined. Sometimes they want to remain anonymous, so the outsider witness is on the end of a conference call. And we all have conference calling facilities. But other times they've been happy for me to retell what I understand to be their story, maybe to a niece of mine who had a similar experience, and then to interview my niece and record that interview. I'll throw in a free cappuccino, but I don't need to do that. My niece will be very, very motivated to play a part in someone else's healing. And so I'll then interview her about what she heard in the story, according to those 4 categories, record it, take that back to the next interview, play the audio recording, and then interview Marianne about what she heard in my niece's retelling. So there are so many options for this, and so, but once people have experienced, if they want more of it, it's so powerful. But I believe in clinical contexts, and I work with communities in crises or where there's high conflict. I think it's critical to structure the retelling. The open mic policy can have very negative consequences, and we can't, we're ethically responsible for the outcome of these community-wide meetings, so it's very important we have the opportunity to structure them in ways that we know are likely to be healing, in which people will be taken away from what's known and familiar to what it might be possible for them to know. It's a long response to your reflections, but, There was a question behind you or a comment behind you.
I just think it's interesting, especially myself having grown up in New York, and now I work part-time at another nonprofit that's housed within a bank. So it's interesting to hear a lot of the discussion of economics being brought into it, because for a lot of New Yorkers, that's a really key issue, and they internalize that, and they create some really personal, definitive values about an individual based on those ideas.
Yeah, well, these discourses of economics are pervasive, and they're hard to get away from as well. Like, some people see my interviews and they say, look, Michael, I can see that you give credit to the people who consult you for the changes they make in their lives. And you give them all the credit, and you take a one-down position. And I say, I don't give them any credit. I've never given anybody any credit for the changes they've made in their life. I can't emphasise that strongly enough. So people say, I'm surprised at you, Michael, you take all the credit. And I say, look, I don't give myself any credit for any of the changes that take place in this work. I've never given myself credit. And they say, well, who do you give the credit to? I say, credit, debit, economics, commerce. I mean, it's enough that we have to live this out in our daily life in every other way. Do we have to bring it into this room here? Because this is a very thin understanding of what's going on here. That, what are the politics of me giving people credit? Well, that's to do with the power relationship for a start, isn't it? In my position to judge. And going one down is to actually, it's part of a power relationship as well. Like, it's, to go one down and to say, no, I didn't do anything, it's all you, is like to construct the people who consult us as the other. Like, we're not in the picture, it's just them that they needed attention. And it actually, it's very, very problematic, these discourses, if people acknowledge that you played some role in significant changes in their life, what happens if you somehow disqualify that acknowledgement? I mean, because this acknowledgement is a gift. What happens if you don't accept a gift? It's hugely problematic. And for me, I do know that when people consult me, their lives change for it. I know I play a part in that, but I know my life changes as well. You can't account for this in terms of these discourses of economics and commerce. There's just no way that you can account for this in ways that are significant, in ways that are likely to have enduring positive effects on the further development of your own work, or the further development of your own relationships, or the further development of steps that you might take to come to terms with trauma in your own life. I mean, you just can't account for it through these discourses, but they're very pervasive. So, yeah.
So what other language do you use?
I just am happy to speak about my sense of catharsis. I'm happy to speak about that. I don't use the word catharsis, but it's important for me to give some an account of how these conversations touch my life. Okay, they may have touched my life in a way that opened up a new conversation with a friend of mine around my experience of their inclusion in my life that I hadn't been fully aware of up to that point. And that enriches my friendship. I mean, it's about making this acknowledgement, but that has nothing to do with the discourses of commerce or economics. So, yeah.
I'm curious about how, or if like you've applied your work to groups, doing stuff in groups and doing stuff in communities, and how that translates.
I think in groups, that you've got a ready-made outside of witness group, and so I'll interview a group member, and the other group members are in the outside witness position. And it's very interesting that initially you see a strong expectation on behalf of all group members to be at the centre, to have a turn, being at the centre. You see this gradually dissolving as they begin to experience some of the positive benefits of being in the outside witness position, because this is actually moves them as well. in very significant ways. So when we work with communities, we'll talk about that a bit tomorrow, and I'll come back to that question about how do we structure this in community-wide gatherings. How do we go about doing this? Yeah.
Have you been able to do any of this work within the national mental health system in Australia? And if so, what did you encounter?
That's a very big question, and we've been involved with organisations of so-called consumers of psychiatric services or mental health services who want a stronger voice in terms of service provision. And so we've actually got together with consumers and service providers and structuring meetings around these sorts of practices in which the knowledges and skills that consumers have and their understandings of what is healing for them, these are elevated in these conversations, and service providers have an opportunity to respond with proposals for how they might proceed in their own work that is much more in harmony with what consumers know about what's important for them. So we've engaged in these community initiatives in Canberra, which is the capital city of Australia, but also in Adelaide. So, yeah.
Likewise, have you worked with the education system at all in Australia or any place to work with educators around the issues or the topic of narrative therapy? And if so, how have you done that, and what has been the response? And what are some of the suggestions you might have for them?
I haven't personally been involved in training events that just focus on the educational system per se, but a lot of people in the educational world come along to our training programs, and including school counsellors who in lots of places have undertaken some really exciting initiatives